There is a paradox hanging over every record Gregory Isaacs ever made. The voice that made other people feel safe rose out of a life that almost never was. When Night Nurse comes on in an old Kingston taxi, on a London pirate station, or from a dusty stereo in some damp Brixton flat, it sounds like a promise. Someone will sit up with you through the worst of the night. Someone will lay a cool hand on your chest when the world is falling apart. The bass is slow, the groove unhurried, and that voice, soft, nasal, endlessly patient, seems to be telling you that whatever this particular pain is, it can be tended. For the people dropping the needle on the record, Night Nurse is a comfort blanket. For the man singing it, night was almost never gentle. Gregory Anthony Isaacs spent more evenings than he could count in holding cells and lockups, in cheap rooms where the rent was overdue, in hotel corridors that smelled of disinfectant and burnt foil. Promoters would wait for him at showtime, wondering if he would walk through the door sober, or walk through it at all. Dealers waited too. Some nights he made it to the stage in a pressed suit and a felt hat. Some nights he did not make it anywhere anyone had paid for. If you listen closely, the contradiction is already in the song. Only you alone can quench this here pain, he pleads, like a man negotiating with a drug, a lover, a doctor, and a god all at once. How does somebody become the night nurse for an entire generation and still die from a wound nobody manages to dress? To understand that, you have to walk back from that quiet, confident vocal to the place it was first forged. A strip of Kingston, where safety was a rumor, and the surest way to be heard was to bend your fear into melody. Gregory Isaacs was born in July, 1951 inches. Fletcher's Land, a crowded, poor neighborhood of central Kingston, Jamaica, at the tail end of the British Empire. The streets were narrow, houses made of board and zinc, drains running along the side of the road carrying away whatever the city did not know where else to put. At night, the air filled with the heavy low end of sound systems, huge stacks of speakers built from scrap wood and wire, shaking windows as they battled each other for the right to control the street for a few hours. American soul, ska, early rocksteady, snatches of calypso and mento. All of it poured through open windows and under doors, slipping into the ears of children who did not yet know that this noise would be their history. Inside one of those houses, there was another kind of sound. Adults arguing about money, the clink of bottles, the thud of a hand on a table, the quick silence that follows a word somebody should not have said. Like many poor families in Kingston then, the Isaacs household lived from week to week. Rent was a threat, not a given. Electricity could disappear without warning. School was something you attended when there was enough stability to afford bus fare and a pair of shoes that would not fall apart halfway there. Gregory learned very early that he did not like shouting. When voices rose around him, he pulled back. But he discovered, in the crack between one song finishing on the sound system and another beginning, that there was a different way to occupy space. He started to sing along to the American records drifting in from the yard. Sam Cooke, Otis Redding, the kind of singers whose phrasing made sadness sound almost luxurious. He did not imitate the power in their voices. He imitated the curve, the way they could slide into a note as if they had been thinking about it for hours. There was no single grand decision to become a singer. It was more like a series of small choices that nudged him away from the path laid out for most boys in Fletcher's Land. He joined in on corner harmonies, stood near microphones at small dances, said yes whenever someone needed a voice on a demo. Kingston in the late 1960s, and early 1970s was alive with new studios, new producers, new chances that might pay a few dollars or might pay nothing at all. For a young man who did not see much future in school or manual labor, the risk felt worth it. His first real step into the recorded world came with small sessions for local producers, His name began to circulate in the tiny, fiercely competitive circuit of singers who haunted Orange Street and its neighboring lanes. The early records are rough, sometimes buried under thin arrangements, but a few things are already clear. The voice is lighter than it will be later, but it is steady. He does not rush. Where other singers push through gaps in the rhythm, Isaacs lets the music breathe around him, as if he is confident the listener will wait. He tried belonging to other people's shapes for a while. With the Concords, a vocal trio, he wore matching suits and leaned into choreographed harmonies, chasing the last shimmer of the rocksteady era. The group cut records, even had minor local success. But nothing about it felt like home. Bands split. Producers moved on. By the early 1970s, he had seen enough to know that if he wanted to control anything about his life, it could not be just his voice. It would have to be the tape, the label, the shop, the whole circuit. Isaacs opened a narrow little record store on Chancery Lane in downtown Kingston and called it African Museum. It doubled as a label. It tripled as an office. Behind the counter, they stacked 7-inch singles by themselves and other artists. In the back, they argued over mixes, counted small piles of cash, and planned how to get their records into every corner shop and dance hall in Jamaica. It was not glamour. It was work, lifting boxes of vinyl, negotiating with shop owners, persuading sound system operators that this new tune would, in fact, make people dance. From that cramped base, a distinct kind of song began to emerge. In 1974, My Only Lover slipped onto local airwaves with its gentle guitar, unhurried rhythm, and a vocal that sounded like a private confession overheard. The lyrics are simple, almost bare, but Isaac sings them as if he is resting his forehead against someone else's shoulder. There is no performance of macho bravado, no protest slogan, just a kind of exhausted tenderness. A year later, Love Is Overdue did something similar but deeper. The voice circles around absence, the way desire can feel like an illness that will not break. At a time when much of Roots reggae was turning ever more explicitly towards political and spiritual themes, chanting down Babylon, hailing the Rastafarian Godhead, Gregory Isaacs quietly doubled down on the politics of the bedroom and the back room. He was not apolitical. He understood perfectly well the forces that kept neighborhoods like his poor and dangerous, but he also knew that people did not stop needing love, reassurance, and company just because the state was failing them. His songs made room for that reality, and in doing so, opened a lane that would later be called Lover's Rock. Reggae devoted almost entirely to romance, regret, and longing. On stage, he learned to look like the man those records suggested. The suits became sharper. Hats settled permanently onto his head, tilted with just enough arrogance to signal that he was not impressed by the chaos around him. While other singers leapt and gestured, he often stood almost perfectly still, one hand wrapped around the microphone stand, head angled sideways as if listening to something only he could hear. It was a pose, but it was also a shield. Behind the cool ruler exterior, he did not have to show how much of himself he was pouring into lines that sounded so casual. The nickname itself arrived with an album. In 1978, Isaacs released Cool Ruler, a record that pulled together many of the threads he had been weaving: lovers' laments, streetwise warnings, quiet boasts. The title stuck faster than any single song. Journalists wrote it. Promoters printed it on posters. Fans shouted it from dance floors. To call him the Cool Ruler was to acknowledge the strange balance he held, always calm on the surface, endlessly turbulent underneath. It was a crown, but also a kind of mask that audiences learned to recognize more quickly than his given name. Beyond Jamaica, the myth traveled along with the music. Britain, where large Caribbean communities had built their own parallel club scenes, took to Isaacs quickly. His records became staples of house parties, where the furniture was pushed back and the lights turned low. In London, Birmingham, and Liverpool, his 7 inches spun in basements that smelled of rice, frying chicken and weed. Rooms where first-generation migrants held on to the sound of home, while their children slowly turned into something in between. When those children grew old enough to go out on their own, Gregory Isaacs was already in the background, voice on the radio asking questions they did not yet have answers for. The next step was inevitable. A bigger label, a wider platform, a chance to turn that underground ubiquity into chart success. Island Records had already brought Bob Marley to international audiences by the late 1970s. They knew there was a market for reggae beyond the West Indian diaspora, especially if the songs could be framed as accessible, even comforting. To white listeners, Isaacs did not look like a rebel. He looked in his suits and hats, like someone you might hire to run a smooth dance hall or to host a late-night radio show. His voice was gentler than Marley's, less incendiary, more intimate. For Island's Mango imprint, he must have seemed like the perfect candidate. In 1982, at Compass Point Studios in the Bahamas, backed by the Compass Point All-Stars, Gregory Isaacs recorded the album that would define him for listeners who never set foot in Kingston. The band was tight, the rhythm section of Sly Dunbar and Robbie Shakespeare locking the groove into an almost hypnotic sway. But it was Isaacs's delivery that turned the title track into something people reached for late at night. He does not strain once in that recording. His voice rides so close to the rhythm that it sometimes feels like another drum, a soft, insistent tapping on the same wound. Night Nurse did not explode in the way some in the label had perhaps hoped, but it charted in the UK and became a steady presence on radio, in clubs and in record collections. Listening back now, it is striking how undramatic the production is. There are no big key changes, no soaring backing vocals, no dramatic instrumental solos. The drama is all inside the singer's phrasing, in the way he tightens slightly on the word pain or lets this here drag by half a beat. It sounds effortless, which is always the result of enormous effort. Behind that surface ease, the other part of his life was tightening too. Jamaica in the early 1980 seconds was saturated with both political violence and cocaine. Guns, long a tool of local power, became more plentiful. The island's position in regional trafficking routes meant that the drug itself, not just its profits, seeped into the communities that produced its music. Isaacs, who had always existed in the overlap between studio, street, and stage, was in exactly the kind of position that made addiction both easy and dangerous. Arrests began to appear more regularly alongside his name in the Jamaican press. Possession of unlicensed firearms, possession of cocaine, breaches of bail conditions. In 1982, he served a 6-month sentence in a Jamaican prison, just as Night Nurse was establishing itself abroad. The contrast is hard to overstate. On one side of the Atlantic, his face appeared on posters. On the other, he was known only as a number, a man in a cell with a limited ration of sunlight. No one in the prison system called him the cool ruler. On forms and files, he was simply Gregory Isaacs, male, Jamaica, charges listed in a dry hand. Prison did not reform him. It rarely does, especially when it offers no treatment and little real support. He came out thinner, a little harder around the eyes, but still, a working musician with obligations to studios, promoters and the staff at African Museum who depended on a steady flow of releases. The habit had not gone away. If anything, the instability of his life, the constant travel, the need to be on at odd hours, the pressure to deliver on stage, even when he had not slept, made cocaine feel like a tool as much as a vice. Crack, when it appeared, changed the equation. Smoked rather than snorted, cheaper and faster, it turned what had been a companion into a jailer. Friends noticed him disappearing for longer stretches between rehearsals and shows. Money vanished more quickly than even the most optimistic accounting could justify. Where there had once been careful talk about publishing, royalties, and long-term income, there were now rumors of songs signed away for lump sums that barely covered a few weeks' indulgence. Isaacs himself did not pretend otherwise. "My number one problem is my drug problem," he said in one of the few interviews where he allowed the mask to slip. The line has the ring of a joke, but there is no joke in his eyes. He is stating a fact, almost as if he were reading a diagnosis from someone else's chart. It is rare to hear that level of clarity from someone in the middle of an addiction. It did not translate into an ability to stop. Through the late 1980 seconds and early 1990 seconds, his discography continued to grow even as his options narrowed. He recorded for British labels, for small Jamaican producers, for anyone who would pay enough to get him through the next week. Some of the records from this period are thin, rushed, the work of a man, showing up because he has to. Others are startlingly strong, late flashes of the precision and feeling that made his name in the first place. It is as if, in brief windows of clarity, he could still reach the control room of his own talent and flip the right switches. The shows were similar. There were nights when he did not appear at all, leaving bands and audiences frustrated and promoters counting losses. There were nights when he arrived late, shaky but determined, and somehow pulled an entire set out of a body that looked as if it had no reserves left. For the people in those rooms, those evenings took on the feeling of vigils as much as concerts. They were not just there to be entertained. They were there to confirm that this man, whose voice had been part of their lives for 2 decades, was still standing. The irony is that the industry, in its own skewed way, came to rely on that fragility. A pristine, perfectly preserved legend can be intimidating. A damaged one can feel accessible, almost intimate. There is a type of promoter who understands exactly how much tragedy a name can carry without driving people away. Gregory Isaacs became, for some, that kind of booking, a chance to advertise a brush with greatness and survival at the same time. The worse he looked, the more profound the applause when he managed a strong note. The line between respect and voyeurism blurred. Somewhere inside that blur, his health began to fail in a way that even romantic narratives of the tortured artist could not spin into glamour. Years of smoking crack and tobacco left his lungs scarred. Breathing became harder. Doctors eventually named the thing that had been stalking him lung cancer. There is a particular cruelty in that word for a singer. Your instrument is not your hands or your brain. It is your chest. To lose capacity there is to feel your body slowly evict you from the one place where you have ever held complete command. Isaacs kept working for as long as he could. He played festivals and clubs in Europe and Britain, sometimes seated on a stool, sometimes taking long pauses between songs, as if waiting for his breath to catch up. In some footage from this period, you can see the band watching him as much as the crowd, ready to adjust if he misses an entry or decides to end a song early. Then, every so often, there is a performance that sounds almost like the old days. The voice comes through clear and exact on a chorus, and for a few moments the years fall away. He spent his last months in London, a city that had embraced his music for decades, shuttling between home and hospital. It is said that on some days in the hospice, staff put his own records on in the corridor outside his room, partly for him, partly for the other patients who recognized the songs without necessarily knowing he was the one who had recorded them. If that is true, it completes the circle in a bleak way. The man who had written himself as a patient, finally lying in a bed designed for nothing but treatment, while his voice moved freely through the building, untouched. On 25 October 2010, Gregory Isaacs died at the age of 59. The news traveled quickly through reggae communities worldwide. Radio stations did tribute hours. Old concert footage circulated online. Clips of a younger man in a crisp suit, hardly breaking a sweat, as he glided through songs that still made people close their eyes and sway. In Kingston, murals went up. In London, DJs queued up extra copies of Night Nurse, not just because it felt right, but because crowds would expect it. The obituaries did what obituaries do. They summarized, born poor, found a voice, became a pillar of lovers' rock, struggled with drugs, died of cancer. They quoted lines from famous songs, mentioned the number of albums, nodded toward his influence on later genres. Some tried to frame his life as a cautionary tale about addiction. Others preferred to see it as a testament to resilience, a man who kept giving even as he was eaten away. Both angles hold pieces of the truth. Neither quite captures the peculiar mix of agency and powerlessness that defined his days. For listeners who found comfort in his music, there is a more personal reckoning. What does it mean to lean on the output of someone who was not, by his own admission, able to lean on himself? When you put on Night Nurse after a breakup, or in a hospital waiting room, or on a long solitary drive, you are using the song as a form of care. It makes the room feel less empty, the corridor less cold, the road less punishing. The person who made that care possible did not receive much of it in return. That mismatch is not unique to Gregory Isaacs, but his story makes it hard to ignore. There is also the uncomfortable fact that he did, at many points, choose the path that harmed him. Addiction is not simply an external curse. It is a series of yeses. Yes to the first line. Yes to the next pipe. Yes to one more night. Instead of a clinic or a conversation, Isaacs knew he had a problem. He said so. People around him tried, with varying degrees of patience and self-interest, to intervene. At the same time, the entire structure of his working life, the expectation that he show up and deliver regardless of what was happening inside him, made it easy to postpone any serious change until after the next tour, after the next album, after the next debt is paid. In the end, perhaps the most honest way to look at his life is to hold the two halves together without trying to fuse them into a neat lesson. On one side, an artist of extraordinary subtlety, whose phrasing and tone reshaped what reggae could sound like when it turned inward. On the other, a man who never fully escaped the conditions of the place that produced him, whose attempts to soothe himself left scars no one could see until it was too late. The cool ruler and the permanent patient, occupying the same body, often on the same night. If you rewind further, back before the records and the name on the posters, there is another image that people who grew up around him sometimes mention. A thin teenage boy balancing crates of soda or scrap metal, trying to keep up with men older and broader than he was. Between odd jobs, he would hum to himself, snatching phrases from songs on the radio, adjusting them the way one might adjust a shirt to fit better. On crowded buses into downtown, he learned what it meant to be part of a choir without knowing the word, voices rising together over bad shocks and potholes. Whenever a favorite tune came on the driver's cassette, the first time he heard his own voice played back on tape, in a small studio with peeling paint and a broken fan rattling in the corner, something in him stilled. The sound was thinner than he had imagined, the room adding its own hiss to every syllable. But underneath the noise, the shape was there. He recognized the curve of it, the way it leaned into certain vowels and backed away from others. For a boy who had never had much control over his surroundings, that tiny piece of repeatable sound felt like territory he could finally claim. African Museum, at its busiest, was almost comic in its scale. The shop could barely hold 10 people comfortably, yet somehow 20 would wedge themselves inside on a Saturday afternoon, all elbows and record sleeves. Isaacs, behind the counter, would shuffle through cardboard boxes, pulling out the latest pressings. while a turntable in the corner offered tinny previews of whatever he wanted to push hardest that week. Outside, stolen electricity and patched-together speakers carried those same tunes onto the street, where kids leaned against walls and practiced their own swagger. In that cramped ecosystem, being a singer was never just about singing. It was about deciding which rhythms would make sense in a dance, which lyrics would pass radio sensors without losing their bite, which records could survive endless replay on battered sound systems without falling apart. Isaacs watched, listened, and adapted. He learned how to pitch his voice so it cut through the fuzz of cheap speakers, how to leave spaces in his phrasing that selectors could use as breathing room when riding faders between tracks. Little by little, he was training himself not just to perform but to endure. The persona of the cool ruler did not arrive overnight either. Early photos show a tentative young man in borrowed shirts, unsure quite where to put his hands. Over time, the gestures settled. He learned the angle of lean that made him look unbothered, the half-smile that suggested he knew something the audience did not. He began to wear his suits in a way that echoed older hustlers and younger politicians, sharp, clean lines, masking nerves and calculation. The more chaotic his actual life became, the more controlled his stage presence grew, as if he were determined that at least one version of himself would not flinch. At Compass Point, the contrast between setting and subject matter was stark. Outside the studio, the sea was postcard blue, tourists sunned themselves by pools, and the island's luxury facades gave the illusion of ease. Inside the vocal booth, Isaac stood in headphones, eyes half closed, singing about a pain that would not let him sleep. Engineers adjusted dials and levels. Sly and Robbie built the groove piece by precise piece. But the center of the track was just a man and a microphone. Between takes, he joked with the band, lit cigarettes, paced. When the red light came on, the jokes dropped away. The takes that made it to the final record sound like conversations he was having with a presence just out of frame. Prison, by comparison, was all frame and almost no conversation. The days there followed a narrow script. Count, meal, work detail, count again. The noise of a cell block is different from the noise of a dance hall. It is flatter, more repetitive, filled with the clatter of metal and the thud of boots in corridors. Isaacs, surrounded by men whose names would never appear on a record label, found himself stripped not just of freedom, but of the small rituals that had organized his life. No late-night mixing sessions, no phone calls about pressing delays or tour dates, no arguments over whose chorus should go on the A side. Just time, stretching and folding back on itself. At night, lying on a thin mattress, he could hear other inmates humming to themselves, fragments of hymns or ska tunes. Sometimes he joined in, quietly, aware of guards and of the unspoken rule that too much emotion could be dangerous in a place built on the threat of violence. In those months, the role of patient became less metaphorical. He was literally under the control of a system that decided when he could stand, walk, eat, sleep. Whatever myth surrounded the cool ruler outside those walls did not penetrate concrete and bars. The nurse in this version of the story was a functionary with a clipboard, not the gentle presence he had summoned on record. When crack took over his life, the distances between these worlds, studio, stage, street, cell, collapsed into a kind of permanent emergency. Friends tell stories of visits where he would seem lucid for half an hour, sketching plans for a new album, talking about arrangements, only to drift away mid-sentence, eyes fixed on a point across the room. There were arguments over unpaid bills, over stolen equipment, over whose responsibility it was to pull him back. There were also quiet moments of care, someone making sure he ate before a show, another musician steering him gently away from a dealer hanging near the stage door. One of the cruelest transactions of his career, did not involve a violent confrontation at all. It happened at a table in a small office. With papers, pens, and forced politeness, Isaacs, needing cash, signed away rights to a batch of songs that would generate income for decades. The man across from him slid a check over the wood, an amount that looked large in the moment and small in hindsight. Those who were there recall no big speeches, no dramatic refusals, just a signature and a tightness around the mouth that suggested he knew, even then, that he was selling part of his future for a present he might not survive. On the road in Europe, as his health declined, the gap between what audiences saw and what he felt grew wider. In small venues in Birmingham or Manchester, he would shuffle onto stage to a roar far larger than the room seemed capable of producing. Faces lit up, couples pulled each other closer, people who had driven for hours to be there mouthed the words to songs that had scored their first loves, their arguments, their reconciliations. For them, seeing Gregory Isaacs in person was a chance to close a loop. For him, it was another night of work, with a body that no longer responded the way it used to. Backstage, between sets, he sometimes sat with a towel over his head, breathing carefully, while another band took their turn. Younger musicians, raised on his records, hovered with a mixture of concern and reverence. They wanted to ask about phrasing, about the African Museum days, about what it had felt like to watch reggae change shape around him. Often, he did not have the energy for long answers. He would shrug, offer a few words, then save his breath for the stage. The labor of remaining Gregory Isaacs in public left little space for being Gregory Isaacs in private. In London, the hospice room where he spent his final stretch was, by all accounts, unremarkable, neutral walls, curtains that filtered daylight into a generic softness, medical equipment whose beeps and sighs marked time more accurately than any clock. On some days, he was alert enough to follow the thread of a conversation. On others, he drifted in and out, caught between memories that still surfaced and the fog laid down by illness and medication. The nurses who cared for him may or may not have known the full extent of his career. To them, he was one patient among many, his chart one file in a cabinet. There is a small, stubborn dignity in that reduction. For decades, his name had been both currency and burden, invoked in contracts and shouted over sound systems, attached to expectations he could not always meet. At the end, it shrank down to a bracelet on his wrist, a label on a door. The cool ruler disappeared. The man remained, lungs failing, body tired, attended by professionals whose job was not to judge the path that had brought him there, only to ease his passage through its final stretch. If you stand outside that hospice now and listen very carefully, you will not hear anything remarkable. Traffic, maybe, or footsteps on pavement. The story does not offer a neat echo. No busker around the corner playing night nurse. No passing car with his voice spilling out the window at the exact right moment. Real life is rarely that tidy. What exists instead is a quieter echo, the fact that thousands of people, scattered across cities and years, have turned to his songs in their own private hours of need. The man died in one room in London. The feeling he captured continues to move, uncontained by walls or charts, or the dates on a medical file. The songs remain. They survive in playlists, in mixes, in the background of films, in the muscle memory of DJs who can beat match Night Nurse into almost anything. Younger singers borrow his cadences without always knowing his name. Lovers rock as a genre continues, mutated and merged into R&B and pop, carrying traces of his sensibility wherever a singer chooses intimacy over spectacle. Somewhere, right now, somebody is leaning against a window in a small room, while that patient, persuasive voice tells them that their pain can be held. It is tempting to say that this is the consolation, that Gregory Isaacs did not live in vain because his work still eases people's nights. There is truth in that, But if you listen closely to what he actually sang, to the repeated insistence that someone, somewhere, needs to come and tend to him, it becomes harder to use his catalog solely as a balm. The night nurse he invented never arrived. The man who kept promising that he would drive us home did not, in the end, find anyone to navigate him gently out of his own wreckage. So the question that circles back every time night nurse drifts out of a speaker is not just, who is going to take care of me? It is also, who took care of him? In a culture that happily leans on artists like Gregory Isaacs to soundtrack its loneliness, its parties, its private rituals of survival, that second question matters just as much as the first. Because if a voice can carry us through the dark while the life behind it collapses unseen, then there are almost certainly other singers, right now, somewhere between stage and street, asking for help in the only language they know, and hoping that this time, somebody is actually listening.